A few different former Chicago Bears found new homes recently, making it a good opportunity to look back at what was and maybe what could have been.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook, join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk, and make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Today's episode is brought to you by Blue Nile. Make your moment sparkle with jewelry from BlueNile.com. Locked On Bears listeners get $50 off purchases of $500 or more. This podcast exclusive includes engagement. Use promo code LOCKEDON at checkout. On the show today, we say goodbye to Akiem Hicks, signing with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The door felt like maybe it could have been open, possibly, potentially, for a reunion, but of course ends up going with Tom Brady and company down south for a decent paycheck as well. We'll touch base with Nick Foles going to the Indianapolis Colts a few weeks ago and having some significant interest. So then why couldn't the Bears trade him, and why did they hold on to him then as long as they did, and some of the different questions that linger there with the backup quarterback situation in Chicago. And we'll wrap up with John Fox joining the Indianapolis Colts as well, getting back into coaching, and we'll kind of look back at, where his value might be. And yes, things didn't go well, wins and losses in Chicago, but there's still some value to take away from that and the imprint he had on turning the Bears around to what they became, at least early on there, under Matt Nagy. But let's start with Akiem Hicks, the fan favorite on that defensive line, moving on to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in a move that, absolutely I don't think anyone blames him, right? For a guy who we love to see play, we love the way he plays the game, the way he's carried himself as a leader for the Chicago Bears, one of the faces and voices of that Vic Fangio Chicago Bears defense, goes down to Tampa Bay in sort of that mercenary type opportunity to play with Tom Brady and join one of, if not the, Super Bowl favorites. And I think right away, you immediately feel good for him as it would be great if Akiem Hicks could get a Super Bowl ring. I don't know that very many of us want Tom Brady to get another Super Bowl ring, but at the very least, there can be a good side of that too, a good byproduct of if Brady is successful once again in Tampa Bay, that could be a nice sort of, not finish to Akiem Hicks' career necessarily, although he could if he chose to, but just a good way to cap off and put a nice crescendo on a player that has been so underrated for a lot of his career, and of course hasn't had, great winning success. Of course, some success there with Tom Brady and the New England Patriots earlier in his career, but didn't really get the recognition as a great defensive lineman at that time. And now, of course, circling back around in 2022, he's still on the older side of his career there, but not necessarily, has still carries some of that cachet and that recognition of okay, everyone saw in Chicago that Akiem Hicks is a very good receiver, or a very good defensive lineman, and could see him at that Pro Bowl caliber level. Not that he's there anymore, but that he at least has a reputation that he's bringing with him, along with the success that he did have. I think that one year in New England, they didn't make it to the Super Bowl, but made it to the conference championship game. And a couple years in New Orleans before that with Sean Payton, wasn't there for their Super Bowl win, but at least, again, some playoff success there. But you want him to still get that ring. I don't know if that's going to make him a Hall of Famer or anything like that, but he certainly feels like one of the most important players of the modern Bears defense, and of a really talented defense that we were stacking up in 2018 as one of the perhaps best defenses of the modern era, right? We're not saying they're the 85 Bears or anything, but there were some statistical measurements that showed them up there near, the 2013 Legion of Boom Seahawks and some of those Ravens defenses as well. And of course, the Bears didn't win as much, but Hicks was such an integral part of that and such a fun player that we all loved and wish him plenty of success here moving forward. It felt like maybe there was some possibility for some kind of reunion, still door open. When they aren't able to sign Larry Ogunjobi because of the foot injury. They signed Justin Jones, yes, but could he fit? Yes. I mean, Hicks would have been a good scheme fit at that 3-technique defensive tackle. You wonder if it felt like both sides were just ready to maybe just move on and try something different for a little while. Not that there was like hard feelings per se, but just, when a player has played on a team for a little while at a certain price point and his health and availability starts to decline a little bit, but maybe, he still sees himself as a great player. I mean, he is still a great player when he's healthy and on the field, but maybe the valuation problem becomes a little bit more of a distance between the team and him, and also what he wants at this stage of his career, right? In his early 30s here. I think he's 33 at this point. And we talked a little bit on yesterday's podcast about why free agents might have motivation or not to sign with the Chicago Bears, given that this is more of a rebuilding type of year. And Hicks is much more in that stage of no, let's win now and get that type of opportunity. So I think 1 year, $8 million is what it was reported from the Buccaneers. It's probably more than what the Bears would want to pay for a veteran 3-technique defensive tackle right now. So good for Akiem Hicks to get that money and to get that opportunity to potentially win or at least compete for a Super Bowl at this stage in his career. And the Bears going younger, going cheaper, not having a lot of salary cap space in general, but adding more after June 1st, like we've been talking about this week. More salary cap space is available for the Bears. So maybe, they would have had the room to bring in Akiem Hicks, but I wonder how much either side was fully interested in having that thing happen. But certainly we'll be rooting for Akiem Hicks, kind of taking that Ndamukong Suh role as that mercenary on the Buccaneers defensive line. The Bears could be looking at a couple of other defensive linemen available out there in free agency. We talked about a few of them on yesterday's podcast, so make sure you go back and listen to that as well. But I also wanted to circle back to Nick Foles going to the Indianapolis Colts because, yes, we don't really care that much generally about, Nick Foles. It's not like the Bears are like missing something. No one wanted Nick Foles back with the Bears, but for as much as the team tried to trade him, he had some real interest in free agency. So we'll kind of look at his quarterback market dynamics and how the Bears kind of played things out with that backup quarterback spot next on Locked On Bears. Today's episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at BlueNile.com. At Blue Nile, you can celebrate all of life's special moments, from creating custom engagement ring of her dreams to giving a classic and timeless jewelry piece, all at prices that you won't find at traditional jewelers. Whether you're ready to pop the question or you're celebrating a milestone moment, find jewelry as unique as her with modern convenience of online shopping at BlueNile.com. Build the engagement ring of her dreams or celebrate life's special moments. No matter what you're looking for, Blue Nile has jewelry experts on hand 24/7, and they're there to help you find just the right unique piece for you and your loved one. Make your moment special with jewelry from BlueNile.com. Locked On Bears listeners will get $50 off your purchase of $500 or more. It's a podcast exclusive, which includes engagement. Use our promo code Locked On. That's LOCKEDON. Plus, every order is insured, it ships for free, and arrives in discreet packaging that won't give away what's inside. Shop stress-free and find your forever piece. Go to BlueNile.com today. It wasn't a huge surprise when the Chicago Bears released Nick Foles. The team had been pretty open about trying to trade Nick Foles, but all of a sudden, once he had been on the open market for a little while, there seemed to be this bubbling interest in him as a backup quarterback. And it raised some questions as to all of a sudden, if you had the Indianapolis Colts certainly interested enough in him to sign him, they did give him I think it was come out as a 2-year, roughly a little over $6 and some change $1 million contract to be their backup quarterback. And it was also reported that the Philadelphia Eagles were going after Nick Foles as well in free agency. Not that it created some massive bidding war where the contract valuation ended up, but the Bears were trying to trade him, and you would think if you had more than one team interested in his services, that maybe you could get one of those teams to, offer the right, some kind of something more to make sure that they got him, as opposed to letting it go to free agency and letting Foles decide for himself. I'm not saying that the Bears could have gotten anything particularly remotely valuable, right? I mean, as far as a Nick Foles trade, I'm thinking a 7th round pick, or maybe you swap two, we give you our 6th round pick for your 6th round pick, so you would move up, right? I mean, something minuscule, but still better than the zero gain you got from just releasing him straight up. So it's a little bit surprising that they couldn't find a deal given the interest in those teams. And that would suggest to me that the hurdle was almost purely then the contract that Nick Foles was operating on, that he was still owed, I think, over $6 million this upcoming season. I can't remember the exact number in there. It was going to be one of the higher paid backup quarterbacks. And a lot of that was already guaranteed money that the Chicago Bears had to pay to him, had already paid to him, and had to keep on their books, that even once they released him, they're still paying Nick Foles quite a bit of money this season to not be on the Chicago Bears. And so it would seem pretty clear, based on the free agent interest that he had, that it wasn't that teams weren't interested in trading for Foles because they thought he was no good, but it was because they thought, not at that contract. They wanted him to be a free agent first, so they could negotiate a deal that they thought was more fitting and applicable for a quarterback of Nick Foles' caliber. And so right away, you can point to the impact of Ryan Pace and the contract he chose to renegotiate with Nick Foles for a couple of years ago, when they actually not only renegotiated the contract, but traded a 4th round pick in order to get him on this team. And then lingering with that, then you have the dead money that the Bears are still going to be paying him this season. I believe it's about $5 million of cash paid that he got, that he's not going to that he gets and will still count against the Bears to not be a member of this team. And part of the blame, I think, can also go a little bit onto Ryan Poles early in this free agent process, because with Nick Foles, there was I want to say it was a roster bonus. I kind of mix up with roster bonuses and workout bonuses. There was a certain chunk of Nick Foles' contract that didn't become guaranteed until a few days into this offseason, to where I believe the Bears could have released him before that date and saved additional money on the salary cap. They did not. They kept Nick Foles under contract until A, they could secure a new backup quarterback in Trevor Siemian, and B, to try and see if they could get some trade compensation for him, that maybe, whatever late round draft pick could be more valuable in their eyes to the building foundation of this team than whatever extra couple $1 million of salary cap space they would get right now was probably a little bit more negligible to them, given that they're not trying to win so much right now. And that draft pick could be more of a long-term asset, that cap space more of a short-term asset. So I don't completely blame Ryan Poles as being oh, what an idiot, he made this terrible decision. No, I mean, you can see the logic behind it. It just, for whatever reason, the market didn't come together perhaps the way that Poles might have anticipated it, and they ended up leaving more dead salary cap money in Nick Foles. Because now, as a result, we hit this problem that we had talked about earlier this offseason when we were looking at ways the Bears could create salary cap space. And the challenge with Nick Foles is that when you cut Nick Foles, you save so little cap space that whatever cap space you would save, you would then have to spend and allocate right away to replacing Nick Foles. And that's essentially what happened here with Trevor Siemian. They gave him a 2-year deal. His cap hit this year is about $1.6 million. But the way the guaranteed money played out, he basically got $2 million in cash this season. And that's about all the Bears saved with Nick Foles. So they're spending the same amount of money to have cut Nick Foles and brought in Trevor Siemian than they would if they had just kept Nick Foles. And so I guess if you have that strong preference that Trevor Siemian is, that much better of a backup quarterback option, then that makes sense. But I don't know. I kind of look at it as, a little bit more negligible in that regard. I mean, maybe Siemian is kind of a better fit scheme-wise. He's certainly more mobile than a Nick Foles. And so I could sort of see that. But it's not like Siemian comes in with some masterful understanding of Luke Getsy's offense, right? I mean, he hasn't played with this specific terminology in this system. He's bounced around in Denver and New York and New Orleans and has had, some of these similar concepts in some of those offenses. Like, it would make more sense if you had cut Nick Foles and brought in a former Packers quarterback, where it's like, okay, you make the backup quarterback switch because this guy is clearly going to be better for helping Justin Fields and helping the rest of the offense, learn this new system. But otherwise, other than Simeon being a little bit more mobile than Nick Foles, I don't know how much he moves the needle as a backup quarterback. So then sort of what's the point other than doing Nick Foles a favor because he didn't want to be here? Foles wanted a better opportunity somewhere else, and Foles gets to reunite with his former coaches in Indianapolis, and there were also some in Philadelphia. That's why they wanted him to be there. But I don't know, just it strikes me as like, a weird situation all around that it won't have a significant impact on the short or long-term success of the Chicago Bears, but just, I don't know, seems interesting and maybe not perfectly well handled throughout this process, but you can never know exactly how that market is going to play out. So best of luck to Nick Foles in Indianapolis. Who knows? Maybe he'll get an opportunity there. And I guess in Chicago, if Trevor Siemian has to play at all this season, it's a disaster, right? I mean, whether it's Nick Foles or Trevor Siemian, if you have to go to your backup quarterback this season at any point, that's worst case scenario, right? At very least, healthy Justin Fields is what we're all hoping for here. So we'll keep tabs on what happens with Foles in Indianapolis and, of course, Siemian in Chicago behind Justin Fields. Foles not the only recent former Chicago Bear to make the jump to Indy. John Fox back in the news cycle here, joining the Colts coaching staff as a defensive consultant. We'll kind of look at maybe there actually is some value that John Fox can add back in here. And I think it's kind of an interesting story, the way he's kind of jumped right back into the league here. We'll check in on good old Foxy next on Locked On Bears. Ooh. Locked On Bears podcast is brought to you by our friends at BetOnline.net, the number one source for all of your sports betting needs and information. All the latest developments, news, and odds, including championship for professional basketball coming up now. We got the final two teams there. Hockey playoffs are in their conference finals. Major League Baseball season's in the thick of it. All the latest fighting news from MMA to UFC and boxing as well. Plus, futures bets for your Bears. Win total over under 6.5 wins next season. Low odds to make the playoffs, long shot odds to win the NFC North, and so many different ways you can look ahead to this season with betonline.net, even live betting, esports, and so much more. Head on over to their website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action you need to know. BetOnline, where the game starts. Wasn't expecting a John Fox news update in the year of our Lord 2022, right? We kind of thought that maybe his, professional football days, at least on the sidelines or on the front end there, were mostly going to be done for, right? I mean, after he left the Bears, he was on ESPN a little bit and, was doing a little bit of the media thing. And then he'd kind of just disappeared into the shadows really for the last couple of seasons. I mean, that was 2017 and it was like on and off with ESPN for a couple of years, and that was kind of it for John Fox. And of course, he's 67 years old, so he's retirement age. Had 3 successful, varying amounts of success, but 3 stops as an NFL head coach back to back without even any kind of gap years in between there. That's a fair. I mean, he's got an impressive, decorated career there with a Super Bowl in there as well. So of course, why would he need to come back? But he did an interview with The Athletic, kind of talking about some of his desire to just be back around a football team and back a part of an organization and working collectively with that goal. And he said, when you're in television and stuff, you're kind of just talking to a camera and you don't get as much of that peer-to-peer camaraderie other than, you got your people on set with you, but something about you're talking about football with people and coaching and actually the human connection of it and not just talking to an audience and to what viewers and listeners at home. So he wants to be back in football, and the Indianapolis Colts want him back in football as a part of their defensive staff. It sounds like he's going to take the same type of role that the Bears had last year with Mike Pettin as sort of that senior defensive assistant who's been an experienced NFL coach who can just kind of help out and offer his perspective and be around, but not really be a position coach, right? But still get to be administrative defensively and contribute there where he can. And so I was kind of wondering, do they want John Fox? Why? What's the appeal? And given how the Bears teams under him didn't really have much success to write home about there at all. But as you think about it a little bit more, Fox did set a lot of the foundation for 2018 and that big season and the rebirth of that Bears defense. Like under Fox, I think, they were a bottom half of the league defense the first 2 seasons. Third year, they got into the top 10, but he inherited that Mel Tucker defense and was churning over a lot of the foundation of not to be shots at Mel Tucker, but just shots of how the defense was constructed. I mean, they just did not have defensive talent in 2014 before Fox got there. So it was a lot of moving on from Shea McClellan and Tracy Porter and those kind of guys and replacing them with Danny Trevathan and Akiem Hicks and Eddie Jackson and Adrian Amos, right? Fox doesn't get all the credit for all the personnel moves purely, but was involved in helping, Kyle Fuller grow into his career a little bit more. But more so, I think you look at the coaching tree in Chicago that started at the top there with John Fox, bringing Vic Fangio over. Yes, we know, Fangio was good before John Fox brought him over, but it trickles down so much more from there. When you have Ed Donatel there as now is again an NFL defensive coordinator and has been, around I think with the Minnesota Vikings and has been on some other teams successfully. You've got Sean Desai, the Bears defensive coordinator, started there, was part of that defensive coaching staff under John Fox. John Fox brought Brandon Staley to Chicago, the Chargers head coach. In 2017 was Staley's first year. He wasn't purely a Fangio inheritee there, but Staley was brought in under Fox and, of course, lingered through the Matt Nagy era with a lot of that defensive coaching staff. But, Clint Hurt, for example, was the Bears' defensive line coach or outside linebackers coach. He's now the Seahawks defensive coordinator. So you got, I think, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 guys on that defensive coaching staff that are all currently either head coaches or defensive coordinators. And I guess Fangio's taken a year off. But regardless, right, that coaching tree of defense for Chicago really spanned from what John Fox started building there. And I think there's some parallels to what they're doing now under Eberflus in terms of adjusting the scheme a little bit more and getting some of their guys in and getting rid of some of the previous regime guys. I do think Eberflus inherited more talent than John Fox did defensively, but all of that kind of puts together into okay, I could see where Fox could have some real value to the Colts, not only just for his obvious depth of experience over time, but just that he does have a track record of defensive success. And as a senior defensive assistant, it's not like you're making him D-coordinator or anything, but just somebody who can help out and be a voice there to help and kind of add that experience. You can never have, you can have too many cooks in the kitchen, but it's always good to have more experience in that room for them over there. I mean, we'll certainly kind of get a sense of how things play out for there. I mean, he hasn't been in the NFL in 5 years, and he's been kind of taking some time off vacationing. So is he up to date and up to trend on all the different ways offenses have fully evolved and really in the meat of that and how defenses have responded? We'll see, but good to have Foxy back in the NFL, and we'll keep an eye on in Indianapolis. But for both how John Fox's defense does and maybe how Nick Foles does, depending on how that quarterback situation plays out as well. Plus, Akiem Hicks with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, we certainly more wholeheartedly wish him all of the best of success and luck down there. We'll certainly keep tabs on any and all free agent additions the Bears might make here as their June 1st salary cap space kicks in. I think the Bears right now are among the top 5 in current salary cap space in the NFL. I think the added $7 million puts them at $22 million right now. So we broke down some free agent options on yesterday's podcast. We broke down the salary cap machinations that made this salary cap space on on Tuesday's podcast. Anyway, earlier this week, those were the back-to-back-to-back podcasts here. So I hope you listen to those and make sure you're up to date on where the Bears stand right now. We'll break down any and all moves here. So I hope you'll keep following along, keep tuning in, and hit that subscribe button to keep up with all of our daily in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. We'll be back next week with any and all transactions. We'll keep chugging away throughout this offseason, and I hope that as a result, the Locked On Bears podcast makes it that much easier for you to bear down.